Good morning and welcome to Rising. We have some news that broke over the weekend. Former Republican Senator Bob Dole died early yesterday morning at the age of 98. The Elizabeth Dole Foundation announced the news, saying, quote, "It is with heavy hearts we announce Senator Dole died early this morning in his sleep. At age 98, he had served the United States of America faithfully for 79 years. Robbie, what was your reaction?
I mean, he was an iconic figure from a recent but very different version of the Republican Party. He was the first time I was aware, as a kid, of like who was running for president. So this this was the 96 election.
Yeah.
I was 8. So he's the first political figure I knew the name of. My parents were Republicans. So they were rooting for, against, but they expected the incumbent Bill Clinton to win. Obviously, war hero, was wounded in combat in World War II.
Which ended up making him a member of the disability community in a way that he understood in that way. Like he fought the rest of his career for disabled people.
Similar to how the late Senator John McCain was very opposed to torture because of what he'd experienced. A generation that brought their experiences from a horrific war, to their policy making and to their thinking about these questions.
As an 8-year-old, you might not have noticed this, but my colleague John Schwartz pointed it out. When he ran for president, he stepped down as he resigned from the Senate, saying that he was either going to win the White House or he was going to go home. Didn't want anything to fall back on. And people by home assumed he meant Kansas, where famously he was from. What he meant was the Watergate, where he had a very, very nice apartment, and he ended up losing and going back to it. And then, little coincidence of history, his neighbor was Monica Lewinsky. And when Monica Lewinsky finally moved out of her Watergate apartment, he bought it from the landlord who had been renting to her so that he could have a nice, even bigger place in the Watergate, which is indicative of the kind of Republican Party that isn't around anymore. That the people that half of them are still here. There's a fight over it, but you come to Washington and then you become Washington, and then you live out your days in the Watergate. Literally in the Watergate.
Very different era in many ways. We've got more topics to get to this morning. President Biden will speak with Russian President Vladimir Putin tomorrow amid reports of a Russian military buildup at the Ukraine border. According to U.S. intelligence, Moscow has drawn up plans for an invasion that could take place as early as next year. White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki says the president will, quote, underscore U.S. concerns with Russian military activities and reaffirm the country's support for sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. Democratic Senator Chris Murphy echoed those sentiments on CNN's State of the Union. Let's listen.
If Russia does decide to move further into Ukraine, it would be a mistake of historic proportions for Moscow. Right now, they occupy the eastern flank of the country. That's a part of Ukraine that doesn't have the same sense of Ukrainian nationalism that the rest of the country does. Ukraine can become the next Afghanistan for Russia if it chooses to move further. And it's up to us in the Congress to make clear that we are going to be diplomatic, political, and military partners with Ukraine.
In an op-ed for Real Clear Defense, veteran and military expert Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis argues that the fears of renewed war between Russia and Ukraine are not far-fetched. He joins us now to elaborate on this. Welcome to Rising, Lieutenant Colonel.
Thanks for having me.
Right. So let me ask you this. I generally oppose one country invading another country, would prefer that kind of thing not happen. But what's the argument for why I, as an American, should be concerned about this?
Yeah, boy, you hit the nail right on the head there. We definitely don't want any country taken by force by another, just a blanket across the world. We would certainly all agree with that. We're all for freedom. But when the United States has to take into consideration ramifications of different things and different potential courses of action. You just had the senator there talking about we need to make clear even militarily that we may take action, implying that we could do so. And that would be a catastrophic mistake. Now, we don't want Ukraine being taken by force, but neither does the United States need to be drawn into a potential war with a nuclear power. Because, look, here's the fact. Ukraine is on the border, 1,200 miles with Russia. They view this as an existential threat. They have been unambiguous about saying that they would be willing to use force, implying it very strongly, and now showing with physical actions, building up a no-kidding large force that could absolutely take Ukraine, or at least that part of it, if they wanted to. This is not worth going to war over for the United States, and we need to not give Ukraine any thoughts that we would support them militarily, because they need to, understand the reality too.
Do you think it's a bit of kind of posturing then? We want to make Russia think we might get involved militarily, even if, as you said, that would be a really boneheaded mistake. That would probably be something the American public doesn't support. Who knows if, our Congress would even have the opportunity to vote on it and be thus held accountable for it, the way we, do war making without even the sort of cursory kind of approval from the legislative body that's charged with doing it. But do you think it's about optics?
Yeah, I mean, it looks like it, but I have a concern that some people aren't making it about optics, that they're actually thinking that we could use military force and somehow coerce Moscow not to take this action. And, as you say, we've had a bad, long track record now of war making completely contrary to the Constitution. And this, more than anything that we've done in decades, if there's any thought that we would use military force should Russia move this way, this has to go through the Congress, because the American people have to have a chance to weigh in, because they should not, under any circumstances, send their sons and daughters to die in Ukraine for the benefit of Kiev. I just blanket will say that we should not die for another country's government.
Right, and seeing Senator Chris Murphy talk that way, Murphy is one of the Democrats who's going to lead with diplomacy first. Like that's the kind of camp that he's in. So seeing him even taking that harder line suggests that across the political spectrum, there's some real saber rattling going on here. But what would be a diplomatic resolution to this that you think is within the realm of possibility that people like Murphy ought to be pursuing instead?
Yeah, I'll tell you what makes the most sense for the United States, for NATO, and frankly, even for Ukraine, is that Ukraine needs to declare neutrality. They need to say, hey, we're not going to become part of Russia. We're not going to become part of any kind of new, CIS, they used to call it. But they're also not going to be part of NATO. So they want to be able to, like Finland, they are part of the EU, but they are neutrality in terms of security. And Putin has indicated that would be acceptable to him, because their issue is security on their border, and they're just not going to allow any kind of a NATO force to be on their border, which they have proven in 2008 in Georgia and in 2014 by helping the separatists in Ukraine. And if we keep pushing, it doesn't help our security. It doesn't help Ukraine. All it's going to do is hasten and give Putin a reason to cross into the border. We just don't need to help them do that. Let's keep peace.
And who's more to blame for NATO taking that hard line, NATO or the U.S.? And how, where's the pressure point to get NATO to back off and say, all right, look, we don't need a war here. Let's allow neutrality here.
Yeah, the problem is, I'm just going to be honest, it's hubris and arrogance. We think that because we want to, we can, and we can just do it because we say we prefer it. And so we want to go on a policy that's our preference, not something that's based in reality. And the reality is we do not need Ukraine for our security, or for the rest of NATO for that matter, because we already have a pretty strong NATO wall very close to, right up against Ukraine territory. So Russia's not going to be able to do anything beyond that, even if they wanted to. So we just have to have a foreign policy that's based on reality, not just on what we want.
Yeah. On another foreign policy topic, over the weekend, more than 20 countries, including the United States, issued a joint statement calling on the Taliban to enforce amnesty for former members of the Afghan security forces. The statement was in response to a report by Human Rights Watch alleging more than 100 former Afghan security forces have been killed or forcibly disappeared since surrendering to the Taliban. What do you think? Pretty key statement?
Yeah, this is just awful. But this is also a consequence of the 20-year failed war that we have very little leverage over them. And it's a big personal concern to me, because I still have a friend who's desperately trying to get out of Afghanistan, who is at threat for potentially some of these kinds of things. So the best we can do is, bring as much economic and diplomatic pressure to bear as we can on the Taliban to make good on their original claim of complete amnesty, which they said, not anybody else. But the fact is our leverage is limited.
But why is this so hard to solve? Because the leverage is limited, but we have frozen, billions of dollars in Afghanistan assets, and we're, essentially blocking international institutions from lending amidst a hunger crisis that could see, hundreds of thousands of people or more, starve to death over the winter.
That just underscores our limitations, because the Taliban have every reason to work with us in this, because there are billions of dollars that they desperately need, both to run their government and to help their people. And if it gets released, then that helps them. But they also, they're the Taliban, and they have been kind of bloodthirsty and ruthless at times throughout their entire history. And they're just not as motivated as with money as we wish they were. And so that's why I say it's limited.
Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis, thank you so much for being with us.
Hey, it's always my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you. Coming up, we'll tell you what's on our radar. Stick around for that.